The time for members' statements has concluded. Under Standing Order 43, questions without notice. The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. Why won't the Prime Minister admit that this recession is harsher and unemployment queues are longer because he designed JobKeeper that way? Why has the Prime Minister chosen to leave so many Australians behind?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, what the Leader of the Opposition has said is just simply untrue. That is not why we're seeing what we're seeing happen in this country, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition must be clueless when it comes to the reasons why this country is in recession and why we have seen so many people find themselves out of work. Mr Speaker, our government, right from the outset of this crisis, understood, Mr Speaker, that it was both a health crisis and it was an economic crisis. We knew there was a twin crisis to be faced here because of this pandemic. The Leader of the Opposition did not agree with that position. He did not believe that the economic crisis was worthy of the same attention as the health crisis as we set it out, Mr Speaker, and he criticised the government. He criticised the government for seeing it as a twin crisis. But we always knew that you would have to deal with both, and that's why we put in place, Mr Speaker, long before these terrible figures, these awful news, Mr Speaker, of Australians going out of work, that we would put in place the income supports, starting with the safety net, Mr Speaker, of JobSeeker, and then moving to JobKeeper to ensure we could now be supporting, Mr Speaker, some more than 4.5 million people between both of those programs. And I want to commend again the Services Australia for the tremendous work they did, processing, Mr Speaker, some 800,000 additional Australians' claims to ensure that they were getting the JobSeeker support, Mr Speaker, that they need at this time, JobSeeker support that was doubled through the COVID supplement. Mr Speaker, our government has been standing by Australians to ensure that they can get through this crisis, and importantly, we have a plan, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we not just get through this crisis, that we come out of this crisis, Mr Speaker, and we regain the growth. Our plan, Mr Speaker, is based on ensuring that we're getting unnecessary regulation out of the economy, that we're lowering taxes for Australians, Mr Speaker, that we're building the infrastructure that we need, that we're getting the gas and the energy support that is needed for our manufacturing industries, that we're building the defence force, Mr Speaker, that we need in this important time, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition's great plan for the national economy, which we waited so long for, was a national driver's licence, Mr Speaker. So much for the light on the hill. At least Bob Hawke had the capacity to dream big, and it may have been an ambitious claim to take children out of poverty, Mr Speaker, but what this Leader of the Opposition has descended the Labor Party into is their great plan is a driver's licence.
The member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how today's unemployment figures underline the importance of the Morrison government's JobMaker plan to drive the economic and jobs growth our nation needs to recover from the coronavirus pandemic?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Moncrieff for her question. Her many talents before coming to this place. She was very active in the entertainment industry, Mr Speaker, as an accomplished musician in her own right. And I want to thank all of those from the arts and entertainment industry, the Treasurer and the Minister for Communications and the Arts, and I had the opportunity when I asked for them to be brought together today, and I thank Mark Vincent, Mr Speaker, for his insistence in bringing them together. 838,000 Australians, Mr Speaker, have lost their jobs in the last 3 months. This is another very hard day for Australia, and there are more ahead of us. Some 227,700 Australians lost their jobs in May. Mr Speaker, this is devastating news for each and every one of them and their families, and they have our support to ensure, Mr Speaker, that we not only are there for them with the income support they need during this crisis, but ensuring that we're equipping and supporting them and the businesses that either they work for now or we want them to work for in the future, that they will be able to return to employment. Our plan, our JobMaker plan, has involved a series of steps Importantly, it means keeping the virus under control, and I commend the Minister for Health and his state counterparts and the Premiers and Chief Ministers for the work they have done to ensure we can stay on top of the virus and we don't see a further wave. But it's also about putting in place the right combination of supports and assistance, both to individuals who have lost their jobs, those who are able to keep connected to employers with real jobs, Mr Speaker, for the future, the assistance provided to businesses for cash flow, and the targeted assistance, whether it's in the home builder program or already in the arts sector, Mr Speaker, where we've already provided support specifically to those areas which will be suffering longer, Mr Speaker, because of the restrictions that are in place. Economy-wide supports, targeted supports. But our JobMaker program is all about the jobs that we need to create again. And prior to this crisis, our government had been overseeing an economy that had seen 1.5 million jobs created since we were elected. And we have to do that again, Mr Speaker. But the Australian people can have the confidence that they have a government that has done this before and that we can do it again. A government that on the fiscal side was able to restore the budget to balance and can do it again with the right set of policies and priorities, Mr Speaker, to ensure we achieve that. Lower taxes, less regulation, particularly ensuring major projects can proceed. More and better infrastructure, Mr Speaker, led by the Deputy Prime Minister's program, some $9.8 billion of new work and brought forward works in the last 8 months alone, ensuring that we're making the big changes to skills and training so we can equip Australians who have lost their jobs to get back into new jobs, and those who are needing to learn new skills in their jobs, Mr Speaker, can get those skills training. Mr Speaker, getting employers and employees in the room to ensure we can get the enduring changes to workplaces that keep people in jobs.
Time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Under this Prime Minister, Australia has entered its first recession in 3 decades. Australia now has an effective unemployment rate of 11.3%. How many unemployed Australians don't have a job because the Prime Minister deliberately excluded them from JobKeeper?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, no one in this country is unemployed because of the government's responses. Mr Speaker, no one is unemployed because of the government's responses. People are unemployed in this country, Mr Speaker. People have been reduced to 0 hours, which is the same thing, Mr Speaker. People have been hit by the coronavirus pandemic, Mr Speaker. And, Mr Speaker, I am disappointed that the Leader of the Opposition, while Australians each and every day
the Prime Minister will pause. The member for Lawler will leave under Standing Order 94A, and I warn all those others interjecting, particularly those who I've asked to stop interjecting all of this week. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, Australians today are dealing with the news of some 270,000, almost half of those young people, Mr Speaker, of having lost their jobs in May, and we know there will be more, because of the recession Australia now finds itself in because of the pandemic. And for the Leader of the Opposition to come here to this dispatch box and seek to turn that recession into some sort of partisan accusation, Mr Speaker, demonstrates not only his complete lack of understanding of economics, Mr Speaker, but an inability. The
Prime Minister will resume his seat. Members on my left and right will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. On direct relevance, to be directly relevant, the Prime Minister can refer to Donata workers, arts and entertainment workers, 1 million casuals. There's plenty of examples to be relevant with.
Will resume his seat. I understand the point the Manager of Opposition Business is making, but all of the points he just made weren't in the question. The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, JobKeeper and JobSeeker expand the full economy of Australia. And what our government has been doing has been responding to the needs of those Australians. This Leader of the Opposition, in the midst of a debacle and corruption scandal that he is overseeing, Mr Speaker, corruption, a word that his own Labor member has used to describe his seat.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The Prime Minister needs to withdraw that imputation.
Mr Speaker, on the point of order.
No, members on my left, the member for Kingston will cease interjecting. There's going to be no debate. The Prime Minister needs to withdraw that imputation.
Well, Mr Speaker, if you would allow me,
I'm just going to say to the Prime Minister he just needs to withdraw. There was no point of order. I've made a ruling.
Mr Speaker, I was not impugning a motive to the Leader of the Opposition. Mr Speaker, I was referring to the word corruption which was used by the member for Holt to explain the investigation underway. That's what I was referring to and was going on, Mr Speaker, to explain in my answer. That is what I was referring to. It is the word used by the member for Holt. The member for Holt said corruption. But, Mr Speaker, to assist you and to respect your ruling, it's got nothing to do with you. You can sit down. You've already had your point of order. I'm seeking to make the withdrawal.
Manager Opposition Business will just resume his seat. Members on both sides. The Prime Minister.
To assist the Speaker and out of respect for the Speaker, I withdraw, Mr Speaker.
The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order. The member for Kingston is making it even more difficult for the Manager of Opposition Business. And I'm just going to say I will deal with any interjections during this period in the way members can predict. I find it incredible that they want me to rule on a point of order while simultaneously shrieking at me. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, on a point of order, practice is clear that when a ruling is given that a member must withdraw, they must withdraw without any qualifiers attached.
And that I'm very conscious of that, and I'm just going to say to the Manager of Opposition Business the Prime Minister has withdrawn and he didn't have qualifiers. The qualifiers you're referring to in practice are when there's another set of words added. There are two ways you can withdraw. I've asked the Prime Minister to withdraw, and he has done so. And I'm going to remind members on both sides that the rules for this place are very clear. You cannot reflect on members or impute motives in any way, shape or form. We could end question time and I could discuss all the precedents going back many decades if you like to, and that refers to groups of people as well. Otherwise we'll have a situation that we had in the 1970s where a group were imputed, and the initial ruling had been that it had to apply to individual members, and we had a procession of members getting up on the same point of order. The member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government's JobMaker plan is creating jobs, building infrastructure and boosting the economy as part of the recovery from COVID-19?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I do thank the member for Mallee for not just her question, Mr Speaker, but for her continued advocacy for jobs in her rural Victorian electorate, Mr Speaker. She is a great advocate for regional infrastructure, and she knows that the local roads and community infrastructure is going to bring benefits not just for her electorate but, Mr Speaker, for electorates right across the country. These packages are delivering a $1.8 billion benefit to communities across the nation. Mr Speaker, the JobMaker is being bolstered by our $100 billion pipeline of investment over the next decade, making sure that we, through the back of COVID-19, reconnect people with work. Of course, we have engaged through the JobKeeper programs and through other programs. We have engaged businesses to try to remain open as best they could, Mr Speaker, but also to continue to employ people, because that's what it's all about. Jobs. Our policies are focused on making sure that people are in work and making sure that there are jobs available. And in Mallee, we're building the South Mildura Regional Sporting Precinct. It's a $17.5 million commitment. Predicted 200,000 visitations per year. What it's going to involve is the construction of a full-sized Australian rules footy field, Mr Speaker, 124-space sealed car park, expected 90% local employment in the construction of this. And I hear that the Richmond Tigers, I know that the Education Minister will be delighted to hear that they're interested in playing a practice match there. The project is progressing ahead of schedule. Mr Speaker, South Mildura Sporting Club President Mark Bresnan said, "This is going to provide amazing opportunities. This new precinct is not just about providing a home to the stakeholders directly involved, it's going to have a significant impact on the whole community." Now, the South Mildura Football and Netball Club, their footy glory days were back in the late 60s. They won the premierships of the Sunraysia Football League. It's a good competition, 68, 69 and 70. They're the Bulldogs. We want to put more bite into them, Mr Speaker, and we're doing just that. But not just that. Horsham Livestock Exchange, $1.49 million grant. Now, that's 15 to 20 jobs in the construction phase, Mr Speaker. Provision of fixed roofing to the 23,400 square metre yards. Providing shelter, providing shade. I've been there with the member for Mallee. I know how important a project this is. This livestock exchange generates more than $70 million of livestock sales annually. They're big projects. They involve jobs. They involve regional development. Mark Radford, Mayor of Horsham Rural City Council, said the Horsham Livestock Exchange project is providing jobs in our community right now and will deliver an industry-standard facility that will be best practice, helping to keep animals and workers safe. And that's what it's all about, creating jobs, creating opportunities, creating work for people in that wonderful seat of Mallee, so well represented by the member.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Under this Prime Minister, Australia has entered its first recession in 3 decades. 835,000 Australians have lost their jobs since March. How many unemployed Australians don't have a job because the Prime Minister deliberately excluded them from JobKeeper?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I would say to the member for Rankin, if he rang up the Premier of Queensland, there'd be 66,000 more people in a job if she lifted those restrictions. It's more than $600 million a month to the Queensland economy. All he has to do is pick up the phone to that Labor Premier and get her to lift the restrictions. Now, the reality is, Mr Speaker, we put in place a $70 billion JobKeeper program that is supporting more than 3 million Australians, Mr Speaker. And we were very clear at the outset that we wouldn't be picking up the bill for fully owned foreign companies here in Australia, Mr Speaker. And we said right at the time that we wouldn't be picking up the bill for local governments because they were the responsibility for state governments, Mr Speaker. And we made it very clear that when it came to long-term casuals, they'd be under the JobKeeper program. When it came to short-term casuals, we were hoping they'd stay in your job, and we put in place a $30 billion cash flow boost to support small businesses based on the size of the payroll. So I say to the member for Rankin, if the Australian economy was being hit by his $387 billion of higher taxes, you'd see fewer people in a job. And under this government, we are dealing with a one-in-a-century pandemic. And under this government, we are working day and night to keep Australians in jobs and businesses in business.
The member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture. To meet biosecurity requirements in international markets, SA growers must freight to irradiation facilities in Queensland or Victoria. Added time and cost of interstate freight puts SA at a distinct disadvantage. We need our own facility near the airport. With the number of fruit fly outbreaks in South Australia increasing, access to a local facility will be critical to our industry's ability to expand into new export markets. Given the importance of diversifying our trading partners for our farmers, what steps could the federal government take to support SA growers to meet biosecurity standards in emerging export markets?
The Minister for Agriculture has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Mayo for her question and her advocacy for her producers in South Australia, very passionate. And I can assure that we've already started. The federal government has committed $850 million with respect to biosecurity, and the federal government's responsibility is around maintaining our borders and protecting us from those threats to our biosecurity that could cost us significant amounts of money. We'll continue to work through that, and in fact, when it comes to fruit fly in South Australia, we've started with specific programs over $16 million in a harmonisation program with other states to ensure that the biosecurity protocols between states are adhered to and monitored, and in fact that farmers themselves on properties work together one side of the border to the other. And we're also looking to the research and technology, the new jobs, the sexy jobs within agriculture. We've invested over $2 million into breeding and spreading sterile fruit fly to ensure we reduce the numbers of fruit fly right across South Australia and the country. That's the sort of investment that we want to make sure, real investments in reducing the number of fruit fly and the threat to South Australia in particular. We'll work and continue to work with the South Australian state government in a cooperative and collaborative way in seeing if there is measures that we can take. And I appreciate the fact that industry themselves in South Australia are putting their hands in their pockets, and it's important that we work together, industry, state and federal governments, in trying to continue to improve our opportunities to export the best food and fibre around the world.
The member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House of the Morrison government's strong record in creating jobs? How will the Morrison government's JobMaker plan ensure more jobs are being created as our economy recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Barara for his question and acknowledge his extensive work in Indigenous health, in mental health and in education, Mr Speaker, and his strong advocacy on those issues. Now, Mr Speaker, we entered this economic crisis from a position of economic strength. The Coalition has helped create over 1.5 million jobs since we came to government, Mr Speaker. We have seen the participation rate reach a record high, Mr Speaker. We saw youth unemployment fall. We saw the gender pay gap narrow, Mr Speaker. When it came to employment growth, we were in February had an employment growth rate of 2%, which was double the OECD average. In February, unemployment was 5.1%, which compared to 5.7% when we came to government. Now, of course, the economy has been hit by this one-in-a-century pandemic. And what we saw today in the unemployment numbers, with the unemployment rate increased to 7.1% and 228,000 people lose their job over the month of May. Now, Mr Speaker, these are not just numbers. These are family members, these are friends, these are workmates, these are neighbours. That's the human toll of the coronavirus. And that's why this government has responded, Mr Speaker, with a range of income supports, but also the Home Builder program, knowing that there is around 1 million people employed in the construction sector, with the extension of the instant asset write-off, recognising that investment creates jobs, and of course the infrastructure program, bringing forward since last November $7.8 billion of infrastructure programs and fast-tracking 15 projects, helping to create more than 60,000 jobs. Now, Mr Speaker, while the Coalition was putting in place $260 billion of income support, the cash flow boost, doubling the safety net and providing cash payments to households, and of course the JobKeeper program, what was the shadow ERC working on in the great traditions of Hawke and Keating? What was their single signature economic policy that they were working on to help get the economy working, Mr Speaker, and getting Australians back into work? What was it? What was the member for Rankin and the member for Grainland working on, Mr Speaker? They were working on, wait for it, a national driver's licence, Mr Speaker, a national driver's licence as their single economic policy. Now, even the member for Rankin can't blame the media for that, Mr Speaker. That is the reality. A national driver's licence, Mr Speaker, L plates from economic lightweights.
The member for Chifley has the call.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Leader of the Opposition, understanding Order 99, and it relates to the motion standing in his name with respect to the disallowance of the Australia Post regulations, and I ask, why is the motion urgent?
The Leader of the Opposition.
Very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Chifley for his question, and it goes to two great passions of the member for
Members on
Chifley.
my right.
The passions of job creation and the protection of jobs, particularly for our posties, and the passion of service delivery, particularly for vulnerable Australians. And that's why it's urgent that the House deal with the motion to disallow Australia Post regulations. There are two ways that laws can come into effect. One is through legislation, the other is by regulation, and the only way that the House can have any scrutiny of it, and therefore the Australian people, is through the disallowable instrument provisions. And that's why it's urgent that standing orders and the provisions of House of Reps practice allow for the consideration at the first possible opportunity of a disallowance motion. These regulations halve the frequency of postie delivery in places like Queanbeyan in half to just twice a week. It's urgent that delivery times not be allowed to just be blown out from 3 to 7 full days as a result of regulatory changes that haven't been considered by this parliament. And that's why it's urgent that when a disallowance motion is moved, it be considered by the parliament. This isn't some academic exercise. This is about jobs for essential workers. And for all the grandmothers and grandfathers out there who put the $5 in the birthday card for their grandkids, it's absolutely critical that letters be able to be delivered at a frequency greater than 7 business days. That is why it's essential, on a day that the unemployment rate has hit an effective rate of 11.3%, that we're actually prepared to take concrete action by considering this disallowance motion as a matter of urgency so that jobs can be protected. Because it is urgent, because Australia Post customers need certainty. What's more, Australia Post workers need certainty. This is about jobs and certainty. It is urgent because the parcels boom that is occurring should mean more jobs, not less jobs, but these regulations that have been put in, not considered by this parliament, will result in less jobs. There are hundreds of thousands of Australians who could do extra jobs delivering parcels, and that is why it's urgent that this be considered. JobKeeper ends in September.
The Leader
it's
of the Opposition's
important
time
that
has
it be
concluded. I call the member for Moore. Member for Moore has the call. Member for Moore has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister please update the House on what measures the Morrison government is taking to protect Australian jobs by working to avoid a second wave of COVID-19?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Moore, who knows that perhaps the most urgent and important issue, which not just this parliament but parliaments around the world have faced in the last 30 years, has been the response to COVID-19, a disease which has now reached over 8.3 million people, which has taken over 440,000 lives and which is accelerating in its spread around the world. And he knows this because in Joondalup Hospital they have been taking care of the sick and those that have lost their lives off the Artania through COVID-19, a hospital for which he fought, along with the Attorney-General, for over $150 million in investment. Against that background, Australia went into this crisis with a pandemic plan. It's a plan which has allowed us, despite the great challenges, to achieve a health outcome which is the envy of much of the world. It has meant that we have saved lives, and in saving lives we have been able to save jobs and protect livelihoods, because what we have faced in Australia, as challenging and agonising as it is nothing compared with what we have seen with the health outcomes and the employment outcomes in other parts of the world. The quality of the containment process, of the border closures, the testing program with over 1.9 million tests done, the tracing program now with over 6.35 million people having downloaded the COVID Safe app. The work that Australians have done in the distancing has all given us the opportunity to plan that road out, and we are embarking on that road out. That has meant that we have been able to release some of the most difficult social and physical distancing measures, that businesses have been able to open far earlier than anybody had anticipated, and that means that people have been able to be employed. And this is raised with me each and every time I have the privilege of speaking with someone from overseas, because they see the human suffering in their countries and they see what has been avoided in Australia because of a plan which was created by the Prime Minister, by the team, on the basis of the medical advice, and delivered in a way which has meant that we are saving lives and protecting lives in Australia, but also, as a consequence of those health outcomes, we have given ourselves the best possible chance of avoiding a second wave and of creating those jobs. And those jobs are being re-established every single day. But without the health outcomes, we would never have been able to have done that. So I want to thank our doctors and our nurses and our medical advisors. I want to thank all of the Australians that have done everything to save and protect the lives of others. We have more to do, but we are on that road out and we are saving lives and saving livelihoods.
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Franklin.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Under this Prime Minister, Australia has entered its first recession in 3 decades. Can the Prime Minister confirm that women and younger workers have been most affected by this recession?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I noted today with the Treasurer, it is indeed young people who have been most hard hit in the most recent May figures today. I think around 45% or thereabouts of the falls we've seen in employment have been for younger people, and it's 52% of women were affected by those numbers. Now, the member makes reference to the recession, Mr Speaker. This recession has been brought about by the coronavirus pandemic. It's the recession we weren't going to have and we shouldn't have had to have, Mr Speaker. The last recession we had in this country was described by the Labor Treasurer at the time as the recession we had to have. We should never have to have a recession, Mr Speaker, and that was what the government had worked so hard to do over many years, and the biggest beneficiaries of the job creation that had occurred under our government's policies leading into the pandemic was for women. 58%, Mr Speaker, labour force participation for women had risen to an all-time high. The gender pay gap had fallen to an all-time low. And it is true, Mr Speaker, that women have been the most impacted of the two genders, Mr Speaker, when it comes to employment in this country. That is true, and young people also. And it is our great hope that as the economy continues to open, as I noted at the press conference today, the figures that were released today predated the opening of the economy under the 3-step plan agreed by National Cabinet. And women and younger people should be the first to benefit, because it is in those sectors of retail and hospitality that have been most affected, and they are the areas that we hope would be the most supported as the economy reopens. Mr Speaker, this recession is a terrible business for all Australians. It is a recession we didn't have to have. It was a recession we weren't going to have. But as a result of the coronavirus epidemic, Mr Speaker, that is where we find ourselves. But even in a recession, we find the Australian economy in a better position than almost, if not every other developed economy in the world. Now, that is no comfort to those Australians who have lost their job, Mr Speaker, but the truth is, if you're an Australian in Australia, you are in the best place in the world in the midst of this crisis.
The honourable member for Groom.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's JobMaker plan will help Australian industry by ensuring our businesses, especially those in regional areas, have the skilled workforce that they need to grow and create new jobs in the post-COVID-19 economic recovery?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And we have had many discussions about the businesses in his electorate of Groom, how we can assist them, how we can grow opportunities for them, how we can open up export opportunities for them. And we've in particular had a number of discussions about the Wellcamp Airport precinct that continues to develop as a very important regional hub that is certainly going to power not just only the immediate vicinity, but certainly other parts of Queensland and hopefully many other parts right across Australia. So that precinct is on track to house advanced manufacturing, aviation training and support industries associated with that, and food processing businesses. And all of those businesses require a highly skilled workforce. Now, on this side of the House, we are very much aware that for businesses to grow, they actually need a very skilled, very highly skilled workforce, and that's particularly important in our regional communities. And that's why a focus on skills is at the heart of this government's JobMaker plans. Now, the economic impacts of the COVID pandemic provide us with an urgency, but also a real opportunity to truly reform skills and training in the national interest. Now, over the past 2 years, the Morrison government has been reinvesting in our skills system and leading the way in reforming our vet sector. Now, this includes funding apprenticeships through the additional identified skilled shortage payment and the apprentice wage subsidy for rural and regional Australia. And in March this year, we committed $1.3 billion in wage subsidies to help small businesses affected by COVID-19 to retain their apprentices. And it's helping regional communities right around the country, including in Eden-Monaro, where there are 589 apprentices that have been assisted through our COVID-19 apprentice wage subsidy. And, Mr Speaker, in fact, the number of apprentices in Eden-Monaro has increased between 2015 and 2019, and that shows that locals really understand and are seeing the value in vocational education and training. So, Mr Speaker, whether it's regional New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, Western Australia, South Australia, Tasmania, the Northern Territory or the ACT, there are no borders when it comes to doing business. And that's why consistency in vocational education and skills training is so important. Mr Speaker, we are proud to be working in a practical way to help Australian businesses right around the country create well-paid, highly skilled jobs for our future.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Financial Review reports today, and I quote, "The Morrison government believes moving people from JobKeeper to JobSeeker beyond the end of September will maximise their employment prospects." Why is the Prime Minister telling Australians that the best form of job is welfare?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Now, Mr Speaker, the article that the member refers to does not contain direct quotes from me, so that is an editorial position that has been summarised by the Financial Review. But I'll simply say this, Mr Speaker. I'll simply say this. The purpose of people when they go, the purpose is when you go onto JobSeeker is that you get people back into a job. That's what being on unemployment benefits means to the government. In the government, we believe when someone loses a job and they go onto JobSeeker, the goal of that program, working with the Employment Services program, is to get people back into work. Now, it is absolutely the case, Mr Speaker, that as the many months roll on, that there will be a time when businesses make decisions about how many employees they will be able to carry in the post-COVID and through the crisis economy, Mr Speaker. And it will be important whether employees who are not in a position to have ongoing employment with the company, that we need to get them trained and get them into another job. That is how the system works, Mr Speaker. And that is what the government is working night and day on, Mr Speaker, to ensure we get the right balance of income supports, job programs, employment services, skills training, cash flow assistance, tax reductions, lower regulation, more infrastructure spending, Mr Speaker, to ensure we get people back into work. We are fighting, Mr Speaker, for the jobs of Australians. That's what our government is doing. Each and every day we are fighting to get Australians back into work. The Leader of the Opposition and the Labor Party are just simply fighting with each other.
The member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister outline to the House why the Morrison government's sound and consistent decision-making process is so important to keep Australians safe, and is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for Ryan for his question, and thank him also for the great passion he's got about making sure that we can protect Australian children, and the work that he's done in his electorate of Ryan really should be commended to the House. Mr Speaker, obviously the government's taken a very deliberate approach over a long period of time now to make sure that we can keep Australians safe. We've cancelled a record number of bikies, of the outlaw motorcycle gang members who are the biggest the defenders over there of the bikies who are involved with the CFMEU. I understand the link, but still, Mr Speaker, the fact is we've cancelled the visas.
The Minister will resume his seat. Once again, the member for Newcastle, the Manager of Opposition Business, on a point of order.
Reflections on members. Ask that it be withdrawn.
Yes, I just say that is a reflection on members, and the minister needs to withdraw. Which
I withdraw,
do now.
Mr.
I just
Speaker.
want the minister to resume his seat now for a second. I said earlier that imputations and reflections on members cannot occur and they need to be withdrawn. I'm now saying, given I've explained it as clearly as I possibly can, I might ask anyone if they need further explanation, because if there's further reflections, I'll be taking more action than just the withdrawal. I regard it as deliberate defiance. The Minister.
And I should apologise to the CFMEU as well, Mr Speaker, for any offence that I've caused them, of course. Mr Speaker, the reality is, Mr Speaker, that we have cancelled record numbers of visas of criminals in our country that have committed offences against Australians. Mr Speaker, we've done that because we have the judgment to keep Australians safe. And when you look at the decisions that have been made by those opposite over a long period of time by this Leader of the Opposition, he doesn't have good judgment, Mr Speaker. That is very clear. It's clear that he doesn't have good judgment. He's opposed for a long time the visa cancellation process that we've had in place. He has opposed for the last 3 years, Mr Speaker, the position that we took consistently to introduce minimum mandatory sentencing for sex offenders, Mr Speaker, and yet he folded this week at the 11th hour. And, Mr Speaker, he's had shocking judgment when it comes to the very important issue of keeping Australians safe by keeping our borders secure. The Leader of the Opposition has stood against Operation Sovereign Borders and the elements to that policy which have stopped people drowning at sea, Mr Speaker. He has no judgment at all. And we've seen it play out this week as well, Mr Speaker, in relation to the issues that are engulfing the Victorian division of the Labor Party. But, Mr Speaker, it continues on and on. His poor judgment is on display every day. Mr Speaker, this government has made a decision to cancel the visas now of 249 offenders that had committed rape or sexual assaults, compared to 43 when Labor was in government. We have cancelled 510 visas for perpetrators of child sexual offences and those that have been found to have possessed child sexual exploitation materials. Compare that 510 to 97 during Labor's period in government. Mr Speaker, we will do whatever we can to keep Australians safe.
but you need to make the right decisions. You need to have the good judgment to keep Australians safe, to keep our borders secure and to make sure that you can take care of Australian children. This man is not up to the task.
The Minister's time has concluded. Member for Whitlam, again. The member for Gorton.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Under this Prime Minister, Australia has entered its first recession in 3 decades. How many Australians will lose their job and how many businesses will collapse in September when the Prime Minister snaps back their JobKeeper wage subsidy?
The Prime Minister.
Speaker, the member's question is presumptuous because, Mr Speaker, he makes assumptions about government policy on decisions that have not been made.
Members on my left, the member for Scullin.
Mr Speaker, it is wrong of the member to assert decisions of the government that have not been made. What the government is working to do is to ensure we have the right combination of income support, business support, targeted industry assistance measures, tax reductions and other supports that ensures that as few people as possible in this country lose their jobs, Mr Speaker, and for those who do, and there will be more who do, because we are in a recession caused by a global pandemic. Those opposite may wish to overlook that fact and seek to score points over recession, Mr Speaker, which is what they're doing in this place today, and that is very disappointing. 220,000 more people lose their job, and, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party come in and seek to make political points over this. Mr Speaker, the government is going to continue to provide the economic leadership and policy support to ensure that as few as people as possible are impacted in the way. But there is a heavy blow which is coming on this economy and the global economy in all countries, developed and not developed, Mr Speaker, and developing. But what we are doing as a country is outperforming all of those countries pretty much, Mr Speaker, and certainly the developed countries of the world as we've sought to respond to this crisis. Now, Mr Speaker, we will continue to provide that judgment and that support and that strong economic leadership. Mr Speaker, the same economic leadership that ensured that prior to this COVID-19 crisis we have balanced the budget and around 1.5 million jobs were created, 58% of those being women, Mr Speaker. That was the economic leadership that we'd provided. We have done it before, Mr Speaker, and the Australian people know they can trust us to do it again.
The member for Wentworth.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government's JobMaker plan includes consideration of employment flexibility to make it easier for businesses to employ more Australians, particularly those who have been hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member, and I know he has a great interest in this area and the people that we can help by potential reform. So, today's unemployment figures obviously show that the task to regrow jobs will be monumental and require enormous effort and new approaches across a whole range of policy areas. We also know, of course, that some sectors have been hit harder than others. So the accommodation and food services sector, so our cafes, our restaurants, ordinarily it's our 6th largest industry by employment. That has seen almost a 30% drop in jobs since March. And that sector, food services and accommodation, along with retail, I think are 2 of the hardest hit sectors. They're obviously also very big employers of women in our economy and young people. So accommodation and food services, over half, about 55%, is female employment, and 47% in that industry sector are young people aged between 15 and 24. So when you have this decrease, that obviously, as we've discussed today, is felt more immediately by women, by young people. Now, the challenge is how do we regrow the jobs in those areas as quickly as possible? And in those 2 industry sectors that are presently in enormous distress, that presently have greatest effects for women and for young Australians, there are also 2 industry sectors most reliant on the award system, and there are also 2 industry sectors where there are the most complicated awards inside the system. So there is a challenge that if we can make those awards simpler, we can actually assist the businesses to grow the jobs, to increase the young and female participation in those workforces and get us back to where we were, which was the highest female workforce participation and the lowest gender pay gap that Australia has ever seen. And just by way of that complexity, Mr Speaker, those awards have between them 200 different classifications and more than 3,500 potential pay points. There's an example of a young person working in a 14-hour pay period with 5 different pay rates, not a 14-day period, a 14-hour period. In the hospitality award, a Grade 1 food and beverage attendant can wipe tables and pick up glasses from tables but not take beverages to tables. Taking things to tables must be done by a Grade 2. A Grade 2 worker can also answer the phone to take reservations and greet and seat guests, but not a Grade 1 worker. And they must never wipe a table. A Grade 3 worker can supervise a Grade 1 staff that can wipe tables, and they can provide general assistance to food and beverage attendants at a higher classification, but this cannot include service to customers, and they must never include service at a snack bar. So you can imagine how it is for the cafe and restaurant owners in all of our electorates dealing with the complexity of that type of award. And if through our working group process we can decrease that complexity, we can grow jobs, and particularly jobs for young Australians, men and women.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Speaker. My questions to the Treasurer. I refer to reports in today's West Australian that the Treasurer is holding dinners with backbenchers to decide which workers will be kicked off JobKeeper before September. The government excluded millions from JobKeeper from the start and has already kicked off thousands more. Who's next?
Member for Deakin. The Treasurer has the call.
Speaker, all I'd say to the member for Rankin is don't believe everything you read. That's all I'd say to him. And the member for Rankin, But the member for Rankin knows all too well that the Australian economy dodged his $387 billion of higher taxes and now is in the midst of a once-in-a-century pandemic. And he also knows that the government has committed 13.3% of GDP at $260 billion in economic support, including a JobKeeper program that is supporting more than 3 million workers. And he also knows that we have effectively doubled the safety net, Mr Speaker, with the JobSeeker coronavirus supplement. He also knows that we put in place a $30 billion cash flow boost, Mr Speaker, based on the size of the payroll of businesses, to ensure that they could put that money to their fixed costs but also to their labour costs. He also knows, Mr Speaker, that we put in place an extension of the instant asset write-off for businesses with a turnover up to $500 million, and they can purchase assets as many times as they want, of up to $150,000.
The member for Rankin on a point of order.
Yeah, thank you, Speaker. The question was about how many people the government will kick off JobKeeper.
Yes, so the question had some preambles and some other aspects to it as well. If the member for Rankin wishes to confine the Treasurer's answer, he really ought to confine his question to one question. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And so the member for Rankin knows all too well that there's a comprehensive suite of economic measures that we have put in place, and those are measures that are helping to contribute to the comeback in consumer and business confidence, with consumer confidence having picked up 93% off its lows, with business confidence having picked up 70% of its lows, with the ABS weekly payroll jobs data finishing at the end of the 30th of May showing payroll jobs worked by females increased by 1.4% through May compared to 0.4% for males. So, Mr Speaker, the member for Rankin knows all too well that we're considering a review of the JobKeeper program. But what he does know is that under the coalition, through this economic support that we've put in place, we're helping to keep people in jobs and businesses in business.
The member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government is helping Australians into their first home and at the same time supporting jobs in the housing and construction sector?
The Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Housing.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Sturt for his question. He is a champion for first home buyers, not just in his electorate but throughout South Australia, and continues the commitment of the Morrison government and indeed all coalition governments in helping people get into their first home. The Home Builder program, which we announced recently, has been specifically targeted to support first home buyers get into their first home with a $25,000 grant for new home purchases and rebuilds of substantial nature. And the evidence is starting to come in that this, yes, has been designed for first home buyers and is overwhelmingly being taken up by first home buyers. A $25,000 grant to help people get into their first home. It was reported by the ABC.
The Minister will just pause. The member for Bruce keeps interjecting. He's already been warned. He will leave under 94A. It's probably why the whip seated him near the door. The Minister for Housing has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I'm not sure how helping people get into their first home is something that angers those opposites so much, but it was reported by the ABC the words of Don Crellin, who is the Managing Director of Resolve Finance, and he said the following about Home Builder. Home Builder is generating a great deal of inquiry. I think it's great, particularly for first home buyers coming into the market. It's certainly something we haven't seen before, and it certainly does give first home buyers a real
Patterson
kick
has also
forward.
been warned. The Minister will continue.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I'd say to the member for Sturt, and indeed many of the states and territories around Australia have backed in the Home Builder program with their own schemes. So in South Australia, in the members' electorate, somebody will not only get, as a first home buyer, a $25,000 Home Builder grant, but they will be able to supplement that with $15,000 from the Marshall State Government. So they receive $40,000 towards their first home. This has led Ian Marcos, who is from the South Australia Master Builders Association, to say the phones have been ringing really madly since the announcement. People have been speaking with their feet. Now, this scheme, the Home Builder scheme, supporting first home buyers, supporting 1 million jobs in the residential construction industry, builds on the first home loan deposit scheme. 10,000 people have been able to buy their first home with a deposit of as little as 5%. And in a few weeks' time, 10,000 new places will be coming available. It also builds on the First Home Super Saver scheme, a way for people to accelerate their saving through superannuation. And, Mr Speaker, the Home Builder scheme, First Home Loan Deposit scheme, First Home Super Saver scheme have a couple of things in common. Firstly, they help first home buyers get into the market. They support residential construction jobs, and every single one of those policies was opposed by the Labor Party.
Member for Goldstein. That's right. The public galleries. The member for Sydney has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On the 2nd of July last year, the government promised 80,000 new apprenticeships. But even before coronavirus, 140,000 apprenticeships and traineeships had been lost under this 7-year government, and the losses are just getting worse. Why does the Prime Minister want young people to join the unemployment queue rather than learn a trade?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I don't want that to happen, Mr Speaker.
Member for
Speaker, and
Sydney.
that's why we have one of the first things we did as we went into the COVID-19 crisis was to increase the support for apprentices to ensure that they would be with a 50% wage subsidy, Mr Speaker, would not, if we could help it, Mr Speaker, would not become early victims of this COVID-19 crisis. And we continue to provide that support. We continue to work with the states and territories to have major changes to the reform of how skills training is conducted in this country. Mr Speaker, each year the government puts $1.5 billion to the states and territories to support vocational education and training. That dates back to the agreement that was put in place by the Labor government, Mr Speaker, which said $1.5 billion each year to the states and territories in return for nothing. Mr Speaker. There was no accountability, there were no targets, there was no requirements for the states to report or do anything in relation to that money, and that needs to change. And that's what I'm engaged with the premiers and chief ministers in discussing how we can change those arrangements to better put that $1.5 billion to work. So, Mr Speaker, we are very committed to changing the way skills is delivered in this country. The appointment of the Skills Commissioner, Mr Speaker, has been absolutely vital to inform the sorts of skills that need to be trained in our workforce, particularly those who are coming out of work at this terrible time, and how we can retrain them to be in the jobs that will be there in the post-COVID economy. Now, Mr Speaker, I note the member raises these issues, but I also note, Mr Speaker, that when she was a member of the Cabinet, the number of apprentices and trainees fell by 110,000 in a single year in 2012-13. And over just 2 years between 2011-12 budget and the 2000 federal election, Labor gutted $1.2 billion from employer incentives to take on apprentices. Mr Speaker, I'm sure that actually the opposition and the government agree that we need to get young people back into work, and I'm sure we agree that we need to change the way that skills training is funded and delivered in this country. And I would hope that when we're able to bring forward that package of further reforms for skills training, I look forward to the Labor Party supporting it, Mr Speaker.
The member for Braddon has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is creating jobs in the defence industry to support our economic recovery as we come out the other side of the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Defence Industry has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Braddon for his question and acknowledge his 20 years of service in the Australian Army, and also just acknowledge what a fabulous regional member he is who understands the needs of those people in Tassie. So thank you for your contribution. Mr Speaker, as we fight to get our economy back on track, our government is very focused on securing new jobs in defence industry, defence manufacturing, to ensure that we keep the wheels of defence industry moving whilst we focus on economic recovery. We're very proud, Mr Speaker, of our $200 billion investment in defence capability, and we have created thousands of jobs already, but we will create thousands more. Already, there are 70,000 Australians working in defence industry right across our country. So far, we have identified with our $90 billion ambitious shipbuilding program that we will create some 15,000 jobs. Our next generation Army vehicle project, we will also create some 1,400 jobs, and many more have been identified. Our Joint Strike Fighter program, we've already created some 2,400 jobs, and we know there are many more to come. Mr Speaker, this morning I had the great pleasure of travelling to Queanbeyan in Eden Monaro to visit Lintec. Lintec has a number of defence manufacturing projects currently, which is protecting our men and women in uniform. Lintec is a fabulous example of manufacturing here in Australia, and can I just remind everyone that manufacturing is alive and well in Australia, and Lintec is a fabulous example of that, Mr Speaker. Lintec is the only manufacturer onshore of circuit boards for our defence capability. Not only that, Mr Speaker, but they were also involved in manufacturing parts for ventilators during the COVID-19 health crisis when it was at its worst, and they are incredibly proud of themselves, and we also are very proud of Lintec's contribution to that. Mr Speaker, Lintec currently has 50 employees. We want them to have more employees, and that's why early this year we gave them a grant of $1 million from the Morrison government to help them double their production of their circuit boards. Doubling the productions of their circuit boards means more jobs for Queanbeyan, more jobs for Eden Monaro, and we're very proud of Lintec, and we're going to back them all the way. Mr Speaker, we are very, very focused, the Morrison government, on supporting defence jobs, ensuring that we keep the defence jobs that we've got. That's what we're focused on, jobs. We know what the other mob are focused on themselves.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister. It's reported today that the number of applications for university has doubled this year, but thousands of young people will miss out on a place if the government doesn't scrap its unfair cap on student places. Why does the Prime Minister want young people to join the unemployment queue rather than study to be a nurse, a teacher or an engineer?
The Minister for Education has the call. The member for Sydney.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And we want young Australians to get the skills that they need to be able to get a job. And one of the first things we did when the pandemic hit was put in place with the higher education sector short courses. And we put those short courses in place where areas we know there are going to be skill shortages, areas where we know as we come out of this pandemic people will be able to get a job, areas like teachers, like counselling. Very important. We saw one of the great tragedies we saw from the fires over Christmas was that we didn't have enough clinical psychologists to be able to provide the counselling that they need. So we put it in those areas, in areas of STEM. And what we have seen since Easter Sunday is 20,000 students, is what we estimate, have taken up those short courses. Mr Speaker, we've also put in, with the university sector, performance-based funding. Performance-based funding which is growing extra places in the higher education sector. And how performance-based funding works is we incentivise the higher education sector to educate people in the areas that we know that they will get a job. So we get graduate employment outcomes.
Is warned.
Everything that we are doing by consulting with the sector and making sure that places continue to grow. And we continue to have discussions with the sector. We understand that one of the things that happens with unemployment is that you get counter-cyclical demand for higher education places, and we will continue to work with the sector to make sure that young Australians will come out of this COVID-19 pandemic with extra skills in the areas where we know that they will get jobs.
The member for Nichols.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the Minister outline to the House the support provided by the Morrison-McCormack government to help communities affected by flood, drought and fire to rebuild, recover and build resilience?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for his question? It's an important question because I think it gives us as a nation an opportunity to reflect on what we've endured over the last 18 months outside of COVID. We've had an enduring drought that spread from Queensland right across the nation, a cancer that has left no state or territory untouched. We've had northwest Queensland floods 18 months ago. We've had the fires of this summer that our nation has had to endure. Many properties have been lost, livelihoods have been damaged and tragically lives have also been lost. But the nation has, with conviction and pride, continued to look to the future, and the federal government has been with them with the drought, through our three-pillared national drought policy of the first pillar, the here and now, over $440 million in farm household allowance put into people's pocket to be able to put bread and butter on farmers' families' kitchen table. The communities that support them, over $500 million in infrastructure that will help them not only preserve the jobs in the communities that support those farming families, but also create new jobs, build greater resilience to those communities. And we're the first government under our third pillar to look to the future, the Drought Future Fund, a $5 billion future fund that looks to build the resilience and give our farmers the tools to equip them to face up to future droughts. We went to the North Queensland floods where many farmers lost their livelihoods overnight. $3.3 billion has been put out to support them through restocking and replanting grants, $300 million of that, $400,000 matching farmers and being able to replant and restock. There was $119 million in immediate relief payments to be able to put money in their pockets as well. And then the fires of this summer, $2 billion has been set aside to help in the recovery. We estimated $500 million of that would be spent by June 30. We're now estimating that $1 billion of that will have gone out of the government's bank account into the bank accounts of those people that need it most. And there was over $240 million in immediate relief as well to make sure we supported those families in their time of need. In fact, across those three disasters, the Australian taxpayer has stood with those people most affected and put out over $800 million in immediate support and relief to help those families get through the tragedies that they have faced. And we've continued to look to the future through the Drought Future Fund and the Bushfire Recovery Fund. And it's important that we as a nation reflect what we've endured, the fact that we've been able to endure with such courage and conviction, and that we look to the future and that we can be in the greatest nation on earth. And when those in this country are in an hour of need, that each one of us stands with them shoulder to shoulder.
The member for Maribyrnong has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Administrative Appeals Tribunal told the government at least as early as March 2017 the Robodebt was illegal. Why did it take until November 2019, 986 days, to suspend the scheme and admit to the Australian people it was illegal?
The Minister for Government Services.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Let me thank the member for Maribyrnong for his question. As I've said now in a number of different press conferences, the government moved expeditiously once informed that the scheme was raising debts in an insufficient manner to pause all debt recovery. We then announced that we would be repaying those funds to 373,000 Australians, and those refunds would be flowing to Australians from the 1st of July, and that more information would be provided to those impacted in preparation for that to occur.
Member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is squarely focused on driving Australia's economic recovery from the coronavirus pandemic to support jobs and businesses in electorates like my electorate of Lindsay? Is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As we received the news today of the employment statistics from the Australian Bureau, it was another terribly hard and difficult day for Australians all around the country. There have been many such days over the course of 2020. This is sadly proving to be one of the most difficult years in Australians' lives, for many of them ever. For some of them it takes them back to terrible and awful memories of times many generations ago. And, Mr Speaker, as we have worked over these many months, as Australians have come together, they have made great sacrifices to ensure the terrible blow that has been felled on Australia because of the coronavirus, and indeed the bushfires that preceded it, and even the floods and, of course, the drought that preceded that. Australians have made great sacrifices to put Australia in a position that, while it is a position none of us would hope to have been in at this time, it is a position that has significantly protected Australia from what otherwise might have been the case. Australians look around the world and they see the absolute horror show that has occurred. Mass graves filled with the victims of the coronavirus, economies destroyed, deaths that have occurred that haven't even been recorded. And here in this country there has been a response that I believe Australians can be proud of, and they can be proud of each other. And, Mr Speaker, we have a long road ahead. Today's news is tough, and there are more tough days ahead of us. But I know the government has steeled itself to make the difficult decisions and the important decisions that are necessary to give Australians the support that they need to get through this crisis and to make our way back. This is a dark hour for Australia, but our government can see the brightness that is ahead. That is why we have seen a return in consumer confidence, a restoration of business confidence, Mr Speaker, and that is coming because they can see us opening up and they can see the successes that we've been having. They can see the product of their efforts, and they can see the plan of a government that knows how to create jobs and knows how to restore budgets and knows how to guarantee the essential services that they will rely on by having pro-growth policies, whether it's in skills, industrial relations, infrastructure, deregulation. That's our plan, Mr Speaker. Lower taxes, Mr Speaker. They know that's our plan, and they can have confidence in that plan, and they can have confidence for their future, even in this dark hour, Mr Speaker. And so I thank Australians for their sacrifice. I thank them, Mr Speaker, for their determination. And we will not let them down. And further questions be placed on the notice paper.
The Leader of the House